Okay, what we're going to do is try to give you a few tips for installing drywall in your house. One of the first things that you're going to have to do before you install your drywall is establish the layout of the framing. Ideally, most framing members, vertical framing members, are going to be 16 inches on center, which means that from center to center of the studs, it's going to end up being 16 inches. Now, to make matters easier for you on your tape measures, you're going to have a red mark where each stud should fall out. So, when the typical framing in a house, your carpenters, not all of them follow a set pattern. What you may end up with is your first stud being at 16 inches on center, but it may not. It's possible that they'll start on one wall at one corner and work back on 16-inch centers and just put the last stud wherever it falls out. Another way they do it sometimes is they may go to the middle of the wall, establish that, and work 16-inch centers this way or 16-inch centers this way. So, because your sheetrock comes in 4-foot widths, 8-foot or 12-foot lengths, it's really important that you end up wherever you're going to meet two sheets on a framing member, that each of them fall to the center of it so you'll have a place that you can fasten them. So what you're going to have to establish, in most times, you can start from one side, come out a full sheet or almost a full sheet, and then continue your work into your next corner. If you're laying it down such as it is right there. If you're doing the entire wall, you want to start at the top first. So if we start this way with our longest sheet coming over to here, or here, then our next sheet at the bottom will make our long side over there, so that where you join your sheetrock together on the end, they don't stack one on top of the other. You want to spread them out. So what we're going to do is we're going to start hanging from this side over here. What we're going to do is we're going to have to, because neither one of these will line up 16-inch centers from the wall, what we're going to end up having to do is come out, say, to this mark at 30.5 inches. Once we hang this piece, then we can go ahead and measure and hang this piece. But it's important that the two ends of these sheets both end up over the top of this framing member, so we'll have something to screw them down. You can't just hang them out in the thin air like that, because they're going to end up moving and flopping around, and there's no way that there'll be a sturdy enough finish for you. So we also want to mark our sheet where we're going to cut it at 30.5 inches, but we're going to end up having to fasten it to our framing members. So we're going to have to know where this particular framing member lays out as well when we mark our sheet. So this one's at 14.5 inches. And this one here is at 30.5 inches. We're going to come over to your sheets. We're going to lay out our cut first at 30.5 of an inch. We're going to mark where our framing members are going to fall out at 14.5. And if you have the availability or can get one of these squares, this particular type of square is specifically meant for sheetrock. It's 48 inches long, so it goes across the entire sheet. It's made out of metal, so that when you go to cut your sheetrock, you can cut with the razor knives or sharp edges right up next to it, and you won't hurt your square. So we don't necessarily have to mark where our cut's going to be. We can use the edge of the square for that. But we're definitely going to have to come back over here and line up and mark where our framing members are going to fall. So when we go to put our fasteners in it, we won't miss our studs through that. Now, when you go to cut your sheetrock, you typically just use a regular razor knife. Now, personally, I like the ones with a retractable. They make them with a fixed blade or a retractable blade. I personally like the retractable blade, because when you go to stick it in your pouch or your pocket, there's less chance of yourself sticking yourself. Keep the blades in there fresh so they cut through real easy. When you go to make your cuts on your sheetrock, it's not necessary to cut all the way through. All you have to do is cut deep enough to make sure that you get a clean cut through the paper on the finished side of the board. Now when we look at it, we have two sides of this board. One of them has this grayish looking paper and the other side has brown paper. Brown paper is the back side of it. That's what's going to go to your framing members. This is going to be your outside you're going to see. So we're going to line up our square on our mark. Kind of hold our foot against the bottom of it so it doesn't move around when we go to cut. Keep your hands clear. Hold your square tight to your board. Make your cut down. When you get down about halfway, you can start down at the bottom and come right back up the side of your square. Once you've scored that paper like that, at that point, all you have to do is turn your board where you can get behind it, put your knee about where you made your cut and pull on that outside edge. Now you take your razor knife on the back side and you score the paper on the back of the sheetrock. Once you've established your cut, let's go install it. Now, ideally, what you want to do is you want to end up where your sheetrock joins together using the factory edges when at all possible, because they're absolutely straight where our cut might be a little bit off. What it does is it limits the amount of gap that you may have between the two pieces. There again, is like I said, it's important that you end up halfway through your framing members so that you have something to fix your sheetrock to. The ideal situation is you don't want it sitting on the floor. You want it up off the floor just a little bit. For a lot of you guys, what you've had to do because of flood damage, you've had to go in there and cut your existing sheetrock off to a certain height. If you cut it off at your 4-foot height, then chances are this sheetrock that you've got here will leave a large gap here. So what you're going to end up having to do is pick it up so that it fits real tight up against the other sheet. You can use pry bars, you can use little pieces of wood, anything that you can slip under the edge of the board and step down on so it'll lift it up. But even if you have a gap, because it's a not uneven cut, that's okay. It's more important that you end up centered up on your framing members. Now, one of the things that you're going to end up having to do, you see we came out halfway because our framing is pretty straight. Another thing you're going to have to look at your framing before you hang your sheetrock is, do I have any of my framing members that are really twisted real bad or really warped out of line? If they are, then you're going to have to find another place for this joint. You're going to have to find one where it's not as twisted or it's not as warped so that we end up all the way on the board, all the way up and down the piece of sheetrock. So, once we have that established, we've got it lined up, it looks good, now we can fasten to it. When you're fastening, most of you don't have a screw gun for that purpose, but they do sell a special bit that works in any drill motor. And what it does is specifically made to countersink the screw head. When I say countersink, I'm talking about when we finish screwing it in, the head of the screw will not project out past the surface of the board. Because when you go to finish your board, when you go to put the sheetrock mud on it and things like that, anything that's going to stick out is going to leave a lump, and you can't have that. So, what we're going to do with this one is, all we're doing right now when we're hanging it is I just want to put enough screws in it. I just want to put enough screws in it just to hold it up. Now what this bit does is it countersinks that screw head down into our material so that when you take a straight edged object and you rake over the top of it, you don't hit it. If it was sticking out any, you'd feel it hitting. We also need to put us a couple right here on this edge. it's possible that when you go to drive these screws in, these screws right here we can drive straight in. These on this side over here, it's possible that we may have to drive them in at a slight angle. But whatever you do with it, it's got to be in the framing member. If you drive it in and it just spins but it doesn't countersink, chances are you missed your framing member. Pull your screw out and try it again in another place. Now, if you break it a little bit, that's not going to hurt anything, because as long as it's firmly fixed. When you get here initially, all you want to do is just hang it. Get it there, put enough screws in it, just so it'll hold itself in place and you can fit the next sheet. If you try to come up in there and set all the screws that you're going to have to put in this sheet of rock, you're going to slow yourself down. Get it all hung first. Even if you do it a room at a time, that's fine. But hang everything you're going to hang in a room and then come back and finish screwing the sheetrock off. Now, what's normal is you should have a screw high at the top. You should have another one in the middle and another one all the way down at the bottom. Once split the difference between them, split the difference. You should have 5 screws down the length of this sheetrock. That also comes true here on these edges. Any place you have a framing member, you need at least 5 screws down that framing member. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and fit our other sheet. This comes out to be, about 62.5 inches. So, we're going to measure out our 62.5. We're going to mark it. All right, now, what we're going to do here is we're going to end up with try to put our factory edge, so when we lay our sheetrock out, I'm going to end up having to flip it over. So this is my factory edge, this is my cut edge. So, I'm going to lay out my framing members from that. So I'm going to start with this sheet. It should be at 16, and 16. So that would be 48, 32, and 16. We're going to mark our board so we can find our framing members. And now, one thing that's real important when we're dealing with sheetrock is how to store it. Because, as you guys unfortunately know, it can be affected by water. One of the things that you don't want to do is, when you bring your sheetrock into your house, you don't want to lay it on the concrete. It needs to be up off of the concrete. You can take some short pieces of framing like that, lay it up, you can lay it flat, or you can stand it on edge like I'm doing there. It doesn't matter which way you do it, but it can't sit down on the flat on the concrete. The other thing is, this stuff is not real durable like plywood. So if you start grabbing it on each end and laying it flat, it's going to break on you. Which way works best for you? You're just going to have to figure that out. But one of the things you need to be cautious of is any time that you're picking up and carrying this stuff, it's kind of heavy. The other thing is, clear your pathway that you're going to walk through. You don't want to end up stepping over things or having to move stuff out of the way while you have something in your hands. It's a good way to end up slipping and getting hurt. So we're going to go ahead and cut this piece off. Same thing, we're going to make sure our square is flat up against the board. And we're going to use our knife we're going to use the edge of our square to guide our blade for our cuts. There again, keep a sharp blade in your knife. It makes it easier. That means you don't have to pull on it as hard. And remember, all you need to do is cut through the paper, pretty much. You don't need to cut all the way through like a piece of wood. Then you can take this, break it off, use your knife on the back to cut the brown paper. And I suggest that you make yourself a scrap pile, someplace which you can put your drops off your sheetrock so they're out of the way. So you're not stepping on it, you're not stepping over it or around it. So, same thing again. When we put this next piece up, we want to make sure that these top edges match each other. If you have to use your little pry bar underneath it to pick it up, to match it, that's fine. Do whatever you have to do, but we want this joint tight so it doesn't have any gaps in it. And we want this leveled out across here, but even if it's a little off level, that's okay. But what's more important is that you get it as tight as you can to your existing sheetrock. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and set a couple of screws in this one just to hold it in place. Okay, now we can go ahead and, if we want to, we can finish screwing our sheetrock down. Again, like I said, it's important that when you set your screws in, that the heads of these screws don't stick up past the surface of the wood. All right, what if it does? Hopefully, you'll get them all countersunk, but it doesn't happen that way. If one's sticking out a little bit far, when you go through, you start screwing off, you may end up coming back behind there with something, any flat edge, putty knife, sheetrock knife, it really doesn't matter what, as long as it's a flat edge, and run across your screw heads and feel if you snag them. And if you do, carry a regular Phillips head screwdriver with you and give it a couple of turns to make sure that it's going to fall down below the surface. And after that, it's just a question of this wall, if we're meeting up with another piece, we're finished hanging on this wall. When we get ready to do the others, we're going to turn it around, we're going to do the exact same thing following through there. All right, doors and windows. Normally, if you're just doing your half of the wall, then you can figure your doorway as being from corner to corner on a wall. If you're doing the entire wall, then maybe you can do that with the bottom sheet, but the top sheet, what you don't want, if this is the edge of your door, what you don't want is one of these joints extending up to the ceiling on the edge of that door. So you adjust your sheet where you hang it from so that you get a full sheet around your door, or the joint of the door is in the middle, not on each edge. What you do with the excess sheetrock that's hanging off in there is you end up taking a sheetrock saw, and they make a specific tool for that, and cut it off. You can cut it through. If you cut it all the way through with a razor knife, that's fine too. Windows, you do the same thing on windows. If at all possible, you want to try to keep where the edges of the windows or doors come down. You want to avoid trying to have one of these joints there. It's also another thing that's important, if you can. There again, sometimes framing dictates what you're going to do. If you can, you want to try to lay your sheetrock out so these joints right here don't fall over the top of one of your electrical boxes or your light switches. If it's possible, you want to try to do that. It will make your job of finishing this sheetrock much easier. But what do you do with them when you find them? you're going to take your tape measure before you hang your sheetrock, and you're going to measure out from a known point, either from the end of this piece of sheetrock to where your receptacle is going to be. Now, your receptacles are going to be usually hung off a framing member. So we're going to measure to one side of the box, write our measurement down. We're going to go to the other side of our box and write that measurement down. Then we're going to go and find the depth of our box. Now, I know it's easy to think that we can mark up from the floor, but now remember, your sheetrock is not going to be sitting on the floor. It's going to be up tight next to the sheet above it. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to end up all right. So we're going to end up measuring down from our existing sheetrock to the top of our sheetrock of our receptacle. We're going to measure, write our measurement down on it. We're going to measure to the bottom of that box. We're going to write our measurement down on it. So if you'll write your measurements down, when the time comes to lay it out, you can go over to your rock, you can take it, you can make your marks where your boxes are going to be. The top, the bottom will come from a known edge on that. We can make our marks for that. And if you have to use your sheetrock square where you can hang it across this edge or come back down off of this edge to end up marking for your box. When you get ready to cut it out. Your sheetrock saws have a very stiff blade. You can take them and you can line them up on your marks, and you can line them up on your marks and hit it with the back of your hand. It'll drive right through it. Cut it out like you're cutting a piece of wood. All right. So there again, when you go to put your sheetrock over the top of it, make sure that it lines up over the hole. It should be kind of snug. You don't want big gaps around it, because if you do, when you put your cover plates on there, it's not going to cover the hole. If you come into where the hole might be cut a little bit smaller, it's a little tight, don't force it, because if you try to push it over the top of it, you're going to break your sheetrock out, and you're going to end up having to repair it. Same thing happens when we're going from sheet to sheet or from a corner to the sheet. If it doesn't fit up square, if it doesn't fit in, if it's tight, it's wedged, maybe you've got a little bit of bow somewhere in here where it's riding out high over here and it's keeping you from dropping your sheetrock in. That's okay. You can take your razor knife and trim that edge where it's sticking out high to make sure that you have enough room to where you push this board into it. But if it's wedging in there, if it's stuck and it won't go, you're going to have to shorten the board a little bit, because if you try to push it, you're going to end up breaking it. And that's one of those that you'll end up having to either use for scrap pieces or just throw it away.